you're really afraid about that, that's totally fine. We have a mailbox where you can text. The number's on the screen right now. And Anna, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat box as well for folks. And you can submit your question that way too. All right, let's get started. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today. Dr. Xiaoyu Pu is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he's joining us today from the West Coast. He is a Public Intellectuals Program Fellow with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and a non-resident senior fellow with the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. Dr. Pu, we're so pleased to have you join us.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you want to add before we jump in?
Yeah, so let me, before we talk about the topic, let me add a few words. So first of all, I'm very pleased to join this conversation. I like the idea about a civic dialogue. I think in the information age, we have received too much information. Sometimes there's no way we could have a civic dialogue because of all the polarized narratives. So I really like the idea. The second point I want to make is that when I talk about the issue related to Hong Kong or China, I'm share the perspective as a scholar. I always emphasize my position as a scholar. I don't advocate a strong position one way or the other. So that's my own position in the sense that in the end, if you think about this, the topic is kind of complicated. That's the point. So in a sense that, so I want to make it clear. So you don't have to agree with me for some of the issues. So also I want to emphasize that my expertise really focus on Chinese foreign policy, but I teach about Chinese politics. Hong Kong is always part of my teaching agenda. I visit Hong Kong a few times. Most recently, in this January, I joined a delegation, a scholarly delegation to visit Hong Kong, have some interesting observations. If anybody interested, I can share some of my observation there. So that's it. So let's go on. So
that's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's important for us in Civic Series, right? We want to try and give the basics, give the background without a lot of influence that you get from other places. So thank you, Dr. Pu, for all that. So speaking of which, let's start off with the basics. I'm going to share a map on my screen, or if you're just listening in, then you might want to check out Google Maps and just make sure you know where we're talking about. Let's just start with, what is Hong Kong and what is its relationship with China?
Okay. Hong Kong is Asia's world city. If you visit Hong Kong at the international airport, you probably still could be able to see the big slogan, Hong Kong, Asia's world city. So Hong Kong is one of the most important financial centers of the world. It's a very dynamic city, very internationalized city. It's part of China, but also kind of different from the rest of China. So the formal title of Hong Kong is called the Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China. So that's the longer title of Hong Kong. So it's a very unique city, part of China, but very different from China.
Okay, great. So what is its relationship with China? How is it different?
Okay, so Hong Kong is as a special administrative region. It has high level of autonomy. Basically, Hong Kong government manage its own budget, personnel, and also Hong Kong has independent judicial system. So it's very different from the rest of China. But also the central government still maintains some sort of control, particularly regarding foreign affairs and the national defense. So that's the way how Hong Kong is part of China, means the sovereignty of Hong Kong belongs to China. But in terms of governance, politics, policy, finance, judicial authority, Hong Kong has its own sort of autonomous system. So in this way, Hong Kong is different from China, very different.
So it might help us trying to understand how it got to be this way. So how did Hong Kong be this special administrative unit inside of China?
Okay. So more than 100 years ago, Hong Kong, during China's Qing dynasty. So basically, the Qing dynasty of China was defeated by the British Empire. So Hong Kong basically was succeeded to the British Empire. So for many, many years, many, many decades, Hong Kong was a colony of the British Empire or the Great Britain. So in the 1980s, the Chinese government and the British government negotiated, and in the sense that the sovereignty of Hong Kong returned to China. But China promised that Hong Kong could maintain its own sort of political, economic, and judicial system of its own. So then that's the start of this process from the negotiation. Then Hong Kong, after the handover of the sovereignty in 1997, so Hong Kong transformed its identity from colony, British colony, to a special administrative region of People's Republic of China. So that's the sort of short history of the long history of Hong Kong.
So that just blows my mind. So we're talking about the 1980s, talking about 1997. I mean, that wasn't that long ago. I mean, in my book, really, I was alive.
Yeah, a lot long ago. Yeah. It's kind of very interesting history. Yeah.
So can you just spell out a little bit more? You talked about this briefly, but what does Hong Kong have autonomy over? You know, what do they control about how they operate? And what does China have control over in terms of how Hong Kong operates?
Okay. The formula of the system is called so-called a one country, two system. So basically the idea initially put into the Sino-British Joint Declaration in the 1980s. Then after the handover, the idea of the one country, two system was put into the so-called basic law. Basic law of Hong Kong, its functions almost like a mini constitution of Hong Kong. So in terms of the authority, the Hong Kong government has authority to manage its budget, as I said, and also it has judicial system of its own, and also the finance, its currency, have its own currency, and also
what is the currency? What is the currency?
The Hong Kong dollar.
The Hong Kong dollar. Is it tied to the American dollar?
It may a little bit, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, for a while it tied, but I'm not sure right now. So basically, it has all the sort of like a political authority, financial authority, and also the judicial authority of its own. And the Hong Kong people, residents, enjoy high level of political freedom. So freedom of expression, freedom for assembly, a lot of political freedom. And the central government of China promised they will not interfere some of the domestic, most of the domestic affairs of Hong Kong. Basically, which official, what kind of their specific policy, that's all Hong Kong government's authority, even the judicial authority. So don't have to go, they don't have to go to Beijing. So, but Beijing control Hong Kong politically in different channels. One is foreign affairs and the other is national defense. So the Chinese government have about like 5,000 troops stationed in Hong Kong, and they have sort of government agencies. Some it's called a liaison office. So the central government sends some representative. Manage some issues, especially related to foreign affairs in Hong Kong. So, and also, even though Hong Kong officials, they are selected through a special, sort of like a chief executive, the top official of Hong Kong, he or she typically selected through a sort of election committee in Hong Kong, but ultimately the central government has authority to approve the appointment. So it's sort of like a joint appointment. So the Hong Kong authorities select the top official, but the Chinese central government has authority to finally approve this appointment. So in that way, this is how the one country, two system functions.
So what does, okay, so a couple questions. So one, I'm thinking like, does Hong Kong send Beijing money, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of foreign, so Beijing being the capital of China and like the home of the central government. So does Hong Kong send China money for foreign affairs and for military? And then my larger question really is,
No,
what?
you say Hong Kong send the money to Beijing? No.
Yeah, I mean, like, what are the financial ties between Hong Kong
okay.
and China?
Financial ties. So basically, Hong Kong government manage their own finance and budget. So basically, the Beijing government does not collect money from Hong Kong. So think about economically, financially, Hong Kong manage its own system. So the Beijing government does not collect tax from Hong Kong. So that should be clarified. So in terms of foreign affairs, in terms of national defense, it's Beijing spend its own money to deal with that. It's not like a Hong Kong government support the troops. No, it's a very interesting arrangement. It's not the Hong Kong government spend money to support foreign affairs issues and the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military station in Hong Kong. That is financed and supported by Beijing government, not Hong Kong government. So it's a very interesting arrangement.
Yeah, so what does Hong Kong mean to China?
Okay. So I think different perspectives. If we think about economically, financially, Hong Kong is always very important for China. So even before China's so-called opening reform, Hong Kong was largely regarded as sort of window of China's collection to the outside world. So after China's opening reform, Hong Kong still served as a very important function for finance. A lot of Chinese companies, they listed in Hong Kong's stock exchanges, and a lot of so China attract foreign investment in many situations through Hong Kong. So especially in the early years. So Hong Kong is like, think about it, it's like a window financially, economic to the outside world. Of course, in recent decades, some of Chinese cities like Shanghai or Shenzhen, they are also well developed. So the financial function of Hong Kong maybe not as important as it was before, like 20 or 30 years ago, but it's still very important. So that's the financial. And politically, it's kind of interesting thing is that because of this colony history, so the Chinese government see the sort of the handover of sovereignty as part of China's sort of national sort of rejuvenation process, in a sense that previously Hong Kong was a colony of the British Empire, largely because China's dynasty was defeated by the British Empire. So the Hong Kong in history was part of the Chinese nationalist narrative about the so-called century of humiliation. So that's sort of recover of the sovereignty of Hong Kong from the Chinese government perspective. It's part of the national narrative to recover China's sort of lost sovereignty.
Back from Great Britain and back from colonialism.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like a source of pride almost, right? It's like.
Yeah, exactly. So
okay.
That's, so I'm talking about the economic function, importance of Hong Kong to China, but also I'm talking about politically symbolic sort of importance of Hong Kong to the Chinese government. So, yeah.
Are there other places that have this kind of one country, two systems relationship with China?
Okay, Macau. If you talk about one country, two systems, now there are two sort of a special administrative region. So the bigger one is Macau. The bigger one is Hong Kong. The smaller one is Macau.
Okay, and where is Macau?
Macau is very close to, it's just near Hong Kong. it's a smaller city. It's previously the situation was very similar. Macau was a Portuguese colony. So in the year 1999, Macau returned back to China. So then the very similar sort of negotiation process. China promised Macau maintain its own system. So Macau now is also a so-called a special administrative region, but it's much smaller. But in terms of political status, they are equal in a bigger Chinese political system.
So I'm looking at a map right now, and it really is right next to Hong Kong. I mean, it's on the mainland China there, but it's like just across the bay. It's right there.
Macau is like Asia's Vegas. Think about it. It's a big, it's a middle-sized gambling city, but it's very sort of in terms of tourism, gambling, tourism is very important city in Asia. So.
Okay, and then how does Taiwan kind of fit into this as well?
Okay, Taiwan, actually, initially Deng Xiaoping proposed the idea, one country, two system. The formula envisioned when Taiwan reunified with mainland China, they will, the one country, two system will be applied to Taiwan as well. So, but the status quo is very different. So in a sense that Taiwan and mainland China, the relationship is different. It's very different because Taiwan has its own government. Its official title called the Republic of China. Previously, the government sort of defeated in the Chinese Civil War, retreated to Taiwan. So it's kind of now both sides claim, they kind of, some politicians in Taiwan claim, oh, they belong to China, but this China is Republic of China, it's not the People's Republic of China. So during the Cold War, both sides claim they were the real China. So it's a very complicated story. It's totally different from the story of Hong Kong.
Okay.
So
I think we're going to have
another sort of meeting to talk about Taiwan.
Yeah, I think we should. But for our purposes right now, we can know that it's a very different kind of situation. Okay, so then is Hong Kong a democracy?
It's kind of a yes and no, in a sense that, let me put it this way. I'm a political science professor. Conventionally, we talk about democracy, we really means liberal democracies. That means democracy means government officials are elected through open and competitive elections. But only elections does not guarantee we have a real good democracy. Liberal democracy means people also have freedom of expression, freedom of, so all kinds of political freedom, also rule of law. People's rights are protected. So the situation of Hong Kong is that they kind of have people there, residents there, they have a high level of liberty in a sense that, but they don't yet have a high level of democracy in a sense that residents in Hong Kong, they enjoy very high level of rule of law, very high level of liberty, at least so far. Later we can discuss the implication of some of the new policy of China, but we could conclude that people in Hong Kong enjoy high level of liberty, but in terms of democracy, they are not yet there yet, not get the full democracy yet. They could vote for some sort of like a local grassroots position, but the chief executive, the top official of Hong Kong is sort of selected through a sort of indirect process, not a direct sort of universal suffrage. So chief executive is selected through a sort of like a 1,200 election committee. So sort of like elite groups. It's not the average voters direct vote who should be the top official of Hong Kong. So in that sense, the democracy is not there yet. That's part of the story why some of the young folks, a lot of people in Hong Kong, they try to fight for their democracy. So it's still in the process. So I think we could conclude that.
Yeah, I mean, that leads us right into the next question. Before I do that, I just want to summarize what you just said. So basically, for like a governance practice, it's not really a democracy because the head of state, the persons the chief executive of Hong Kong is still kind of selected by Beijing or by this large committee, right? It's not by the people in the United States.
Very elite groups.
Yeah. Okay. But like socially, right? People can gather. People can have the freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and has those kinds of social liberties that we experience in the West associated with our democracy, as opposed to China, which doesn't have, a very different kind of more authoritarian system where they don't have those kinds of social freedoms. Is that a decent summary?
Yeah, to a larger degree, yes. So, yes. Yeah.
Okay, we can. We're not going to dig into any of those issues in the Q&A. Okay, so you were talking about how young people are now fighting for their democracy. So what is happening now?
Okay, what's happening now? I think it's kind of last year. Last year there were all kinds of protests. Sometimes even violence from both sides, the police, from the protesters, very chaotic situation for almost half a year, right? So what's going on there? And even today and yesterday, the Chinese government passed a national security law, so all complicated. So let me give you some overview what's going on here. So before last year's protest, there were protests before. So in the year 2014, there were sort of, maybe some of you heard the term umbrella movement, or some other called the Occupy the Central. So they are overlapped, not exactly the same. But so at that point, some of these protesters at that point, they want the real universal suffrage. So in a sense that they want the average voters in Hong Kong to have a direct democracy to vote who should be the next chief executive. So at that point, the Chinese government promised to have some sort of indirect sort of democracy. So they want to, the Chinese government could at that point allow the universal suffrage to vote who should be the next chief executive, but they still maintain this kind of elite group. So election committee transformed into sort of like a nomination committee. So the Chinese government want to maintain control who could be qualified, become one of the 2 or 3 candidates. Then you could have, after the nomination, you could vote. So the status quo is that they only have elite control process, right? So at that point, the protesters were unsatisfied, so they pushed forward. But in the end, the reform package was not successful. So that was the first round, the earlier protest. The last year protest primarily about a so-called extradition bill. So extradition bill is in talking about whether the Hong Kong authority could allow some criminal suspect to transfer to China for trial. So initially it's about, actually it was caused by a sort of a murdering case related to Taiwan. It's very complicated. Basically, a Hong Kong guy killed her girlfriend in Taiwan, but because there was no extradition treaty between Hong Kong and Taiwan, the guy could not be transferred to Taiwan. So Hong Kong authority want to sort of change some law to allow this to happen. But if they change the law to allow this happen to Taiwan, they must also allow this to happen to mainland China. But many Hong Kong residents, they did not, or they don't trust the mainland government, especially about the judicial system. So that generated a lot of anxiety. So that started the process. So the Hong Kong government was unwilling initially to sort of like accommodate, then escalated, the protest further escalated. So that was largely explained last year's protest. And because during the protest, and some of the protesters probably, they lost the confidence whether they could seek their sort of the whether they could sort of how to say advocate their demand peacefully. So some of them went to violence. So that generated a lot of sort of bad dynamics between the protesters and the police. So then that caused Beijing's sort of harsh reaction. So that explained this year's national security law. So that's a very brief introduction of the very complicated issues. So each point is very complicated. Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like there were separate issues a few years ago with the protests than what was happening in the past year and now, but it's all related to the same tension between Hong Kong and China and who has control over what, and you know, who picks the top authority and who makes the
the fundamental, again, get back to the fundamental formula: one country, two systems. So Beijing always emphasized one country is the precondition of two systems. A lot of Hong Kong residents, advocates, activists, and some Hong Kong pan-democrat politicians, they emphasize two systems should be maintained, should be highlighted. So then that's become more and more sort of ambiguous sometimes. So how to maintain one country and then two systems? That's get back to the fundamental question in the very beginning.
All right, I imagine people will have other questions about that, so we'll go into that in Q&A. I have one more question I want to ask before we do that. What is the United States' relationship with Hong Kong? You know, I see our politicians showing support for Hong Kong, and you know, generally support, you know, pro-democracy statements. So and I imagine that's also complicated because the U.S. right now especially has a strange relationship with, a little bit of a tense relationship with China. So how would you explain the U.S.'s relationship with Hong Kong?
Okay, good. So the United States has maintained a very strong economic, commercial, social, and cultural connections with Hong Kong. So this relationship has gone on for many, many decades. So I just give you one small example. So a lot of top experts, China experts in the United States, during the Cold War, they were essentially trained in Hong Kong. Why? Because at that point, they could not really visit the mainland China. So a lot of like these China experts in the 1960s and 1970s, what they were doing? They went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. They read the People's Daily there. They interview some refugees from mainland China in Hong Kong. That's the only access they could get to study about China. So that's just a small example of those long-term connections between Hong Kong and the United States. That's about like educational, cultural connections. Talking about finance, trade, a lot of American companies, they have presence, like a strong presence in Hong Kong. So this is very important relationship. And also, of course, the United States supported Hong Kong to maintain its autonomy. So here I want to briefly mention sort of two sort of legislative act of the United States. One is so-called Hong Kong Policy Act in 1992. So before the handover of Hong Kong sovereignty back to China, there was a big question. When Hong Kong returned back to China, how the United States should treat Hong Kong commercially and socially, and especially commercially, right? So should the United States treat Hong Kong still as an autonomous region different from the rest of China? So the Hong Kong Policy Act stipulated that as long as Hong Kong maintains its high level of autonomy, the United States can treat Hong Kong differently from the rest of China. So in terms of in terms of tariff, in terms of export technology control, trade status, the United States largely treat Hong Kong separated from the rest of China.
So that's interesting because originally with the one country, two systems, you said that China had control over international affairs, but this is a special relationship where Hong Kong can have autonomy with its affairs with the United States.
Yeah, let me add on here. So I say China controlled foreign affairs of Hong Kong, but primarily about political and security issues, not about commercial. Actually, Hong Kong, even as a special administrative region based on China's sort of the China Constitution, the basic law of China's government policy, Hong Kong maintains its own commercial, culture, even sports has its own status. Like in Olympic Games, Hong Kong has its own delegation. It's given in WTO, World Trade Organization, Hong Kong has its own delegation. So in terms of commerce, sports, culture, Hong Kong maintains its own. So in a sense that the United States treated Hong Kong differently, that does not sort of in conflict, is not in conflict with China's policy regarding one. Actually, the one country, two system is actually compatible with American policy in a sense that the United States position is that as long as one country, two system is maintained in a meaningful way, the United States should treat Hong Kong differently in commerce and other economic issues.
All right, great. Well, there was a lot there that we can dig into. That was a really excellent overview. Thank you, Dr. Pu. I'm going to turn it back over to Anna, who's going to share with you how you can ask your questions, and we'll get started on that.
Okay. Super. All right. Thanks, everyone, for sending in your questions so far. Keep them coming. We're first going to go to Mark Duddy. He has a couple questions. So, Mark, I'm going to prompt you to unmute, and you can go ahead and ask your question to Dr. Pu.
Yeah, Dr. Pu, hey, thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate this overview. I think you answered a lot of the first question, which was around, what are the interests of the U.S. government or the European Union relative to Hong Kong? And my second question is there maybe another unresolved issue out there that could potentially start a third set of protests and riots in Hong Kong? Some other unresolved issue?
Oh, okay. So your first question, I partially addressed that. It's about like U.S. and European Union's interest in Hong Kong, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think if we think about together, both U.S. and European Union regarding Hong Kong, the policy positions related to two issues. One is about economy and finance, in a sense that a lot of European companies, the same way as the American companies, have strong interest in Hong Kong. So both the United States and European Union want Hong Kong maintain its sort of high level of rule of law, and so that American companies, European companies could do business in Hong Kong. I think that's commercial interest. The second is more about value. It's about political value, in a sense that the United States and European Union's position is that both sides want Hong Kong to people in Hong Kong to maintain high level of liberty. They continue to enjoy their political freedom, and of course, if possible, in the future, also sort of start the democratic process. Eventually, make the Hong Kong government more democratic, more accountable. So I think that's political position. I think basically the United States and European Union position related to these two issues. Your second question, whether there are some other issues might potentially generate sort of protest, I would think I think the immediate potential backlash is the so-called national security law. So because the national security law indicates China will be taking much harsher position regarding how people could express their ideas in Hong Kong. So of course, we will still wait and see how this law will be implemented in the future. So, but it potentially generated different sort of reactions in Hong Kong. So I think that's a potential sort of debatable issue in Hong Kong, I think, within Hong Kong.
Thank you.
And Mark, did you have another question? I think there was another
No.
one. All right. Thanks for your question. All right, we're going to go to Mark Weber. He's going to ask another question. Mark, I prompt you. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Okay. How long did Beijing promise to maintain the one country, two systems situation with Hong Kong? Because that was not intended to be forever.
Okay, very interesting question. So in the joint declaration in the 1980s, in the 1980s, Beijing promised the one country, two system will not be changed 50 years after the handover. That means until 2047. So at that point, the then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders, they probably calculated, 50 years after 1997, that's far, far away. But who knows, time is running fast. Now we're already half of the time frame. So there are different interpretations what's going on after 2047. So one interpretation, a more benign sort of interpretation, is that Deng Xiaoping and maybe some Chinese leaders calculated by then China will be more well developed. The gap between mainland China and Hong Kong will be narrow after 50 years. So at that point, maybe to some degree, China will be more like today's Hong Kong in many dimensions, economically, socially, if not politically, but partially politically. So that means even after that one country, one system, because the gap between Hong Kong and mainland China in different dimensions have narrowed. So that's one interpretation, one possibility. The other is Hong Kong will become more like a typical mainland Chinese city. So that's another way. So there are different possibilities after 50 years.
And who makes that decision? I guess the people are trying to make that decision now, right? With the protests, they're trying to say we want to be more of a democracy.
So yeah, you mean, who? I think in the end, it's a complicated bargaining process. I think some people, and different now. People in Hong Kong, in China, in the United States, different parts of the world, they have different interpretation of this. Some people would argue, might argue, okay, the one country system is already over because of the national security law. And that's an extremely pessimistic interpretation. But others might still be wait and see. They might say, we might still see how the national security law might be implemented in Hong Kong. And it's a tricky experiment in the very beginning, right? So think about the liberal, internationalized the city, gradually moving toward democracy, but the bigger part of the sovereign nation is still not a liberal democracy. So how the two systems could coexist, it's a tricky business in the very beginning, I would say.
So just, I said that I would offer to be the dumbest person in the room. So I'm going to do that right now. So you were talking about the national security law and how that, can you just go over that part again? That was the recent thing that was in the news. You mentioned that people were saying that means that the one country part of the one country system was broken. So we're no longer one. There were all these declarations happening, from folks in the United States saying that now Hong Kong is no longer. Can you just help me understand that part? So like why the national security law declaration and some of the things that happened recently were so important for people talking about whether or not the one country, two systems model is broken?
Okay. So let me the one country, two system related to the national security law is that, as I introduced, the one country, two system, the formula is tricky in the very beginning. Both sides, Beijing politicians, leaders, and Hong Kong politicians, activists, they always emphasize different aspects in the very beginning, right? So Beijing emphasized one country is the precondition. And Hong Kong people, some locals, activists emphasize two systems must be, the two societies, government system must be very sort of distinguished from each other. Otherwise, what's the point of two systems? So, but for a while, from Beijing's perspective, they see the protest, some of the activists protesting in Hong Kong, I'm not saying the majority, maybe a minority of these protesters, they lost the confidence whether they could still seek the gradual, peaceful, democratic change in the long term. So they have all kinds of frustrations all these years. A small number of them maybe go to extreme. So they use violent actions, maybe they burn sort of cars, buildings, so cause the chaotic situations. And also some of them also using slogans like invite American intervention. So even invite, some even show the slogan, oh, American troops, please come to save us. So that's from China's perspective, Chinese government's perspective, that's sort of violate this kind of one country formula, right? So then that's the, I would say the sort of the last year's protest was one of the main, at least one of the major contributing factors for Beijing to implement, to make this new national security law. So in a sense that Beijing want to highlight the red line. Where's the red line? So in terms of the one country. So they highlight like a subversion and succession, terrorism, foreign intervention. These are prohibited by the national security law. So that's from Beijing's perspective. But I can understand some residents in Hong Kong, they worry, okay, national security, the key is, I mean, on one hand, we think about all governments have national security law or some similar laws, bills, including the United States, Great Britain, other countries, right? But the key is how we think about national security. So some activists in Hong Kong, they worry the broader definition of national security. So of course, terrorism is a crime, universally should be prohibited in different societies. But how about the political criticism, right? That's a little bit tricky, right? In Western society, if you criticize political leaders, let's say we criticize President Trump, that's totally fine. But how about in Hong Kong in the future? If they criticize Chinese leaders, if they criticize Chinese Communist Party, is that part of the political freedom or it's part of the violation of national security law? This is very ambiguous, a little bit tricky. That's why some people worry about this. But again, from Beijing's perspective, they see some of the protesters last year, they went to too extreme, in a sense that all the violence, all the chaotic situation. Hong Kong is a financial center. Hong Kong is proud of its rule of law tradition. So, but last year we see, I mean, the situation was not very good. So I think Beijing has a point, but again, also people in Hong Kong, many people internationally from Western countries' perspective also have some reasonable concerns about the national security law.
Okay, thank you. Anna, turning it back to you.
Yes, so we have a question from Yang. Yang, I know your video is not on, but I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can ask your question live. So here it is, and go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Professor Fu, for the excellent overview. My question, okay, on the surface, may sound like something that I could have looked up on Wikipedia, but I was just wondering, did Hong Kong have universal suffrage under British colonial rule? Mm-hmm. I guess the broader question is really, since the transfer, how has the rights and freedoms of Hong Kong have changed in that time?
Oh, okay. Very important, interesting question. Actually, during much of British colonial rule, Hong Kong people did not enjoy much democratic rights. Certainly, they did not have universal suffrage. So basically, the government model is the British government appointed a governor there. The governor was the top leader. So there was even no sort of a complicated political process to really competitively elect the top leader of Hong Kong. So I think the last governor of Hong Kong, before the handover, maybe from British perspective, they want to preserve or maximize Hong Kong people's liberty as much as possible. So they started this kind of democratic process before the handover. So, but I agree with you. During much of a British colonial rule, there was no democratic rights of average Hong Kong people. So, yeah.
Thank you, Yang. All right, we are going to go to a question that was texted in. So whoever's number starts with 857. So this question is, how does Hong Kong maintain its judicial autonomy from China in the case of a crime involving individuals from both Hong Kong and China?
Okay. So
I hope no one's going to commit a crime anytime soon.
So this is a very sort of specific legal questions, but I think it maybe partially depend on where the crime happened, right? I think if the crime happened in Hong Kong, probably Hong Kong court will have a higher authority to judge this particular case. So that's the simple version of this answer. So ultimately, a case, I think Hong Kong has the highest authority to evaluate some of these conventional sort of criminal cases. So, yeah.
Thank you. All right, so we're gonna go to Monty next. So Monty has a question. Monty, I'm gonna unmute you and go ahead and ask your question live. And you'll have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you. First of all, civics is extremely important. I'm COVIDing in Toronto before I return back to Kinshasa, DRC, where I act under the aegis of the UNDP as country director for governance, which is basically Sisyphean. It's almost impossible. However, my question or comment to you is Hong Kong could be considered as a form of a credibility situation because the Chinese leadership is oligarchic. And the last thing they want, particularly in this era of mass communication and the dispersal of public communication, is the fractionation of order, notwithstanding that the supreme leader allows privileges to the economic oligarch elites in terms of how they can do the hybridism in terms of capitalism, so long as they understand what is happening in terms of the politics. And from a Canadian perspective, it's the Meng imbroglio with Hua in terms of the Chinese, the daughter of the founder of Hua, who is being detained in Vancouver, and the government, to be blunt, arbitrarily seized 2 Canadians and are holding them hostage and charging them with crimes, basically of espionage. So my comment to you is, in terms of civics, how can one deal with effectively Hong Kong being isolated, because it's not going to happen, that there is no trust now between the Hong Kong regime and the Chinese supreme leadership in Beijing?
I think it's very, very insightful comment. But to be frank, I don't have a good idea. If I have a good idea to solve the challenge of Hong Kong, I would not be a professor. I would be somewhere else. But some perspective, I think, although we hear different sort of perspectives, but ultimately, I think the long-term sort of a solution of Hong Kong sort of issue is still return back to the one country, 2 system model, in the sense that try to work within this model is not a goal, totally abandon this model. I think I see the argument from both sides, in the sense that from democratic activist perspective, they see increasingly, if they want democracy, they want to totally sort of delegitimize the People's Republic of China government and the authority or sovereignty of the People's Republic of China. That's a no-starter from Beijing's leaders. I think from Beijing's perspective, I think Hong Kong is so important, not just economically, but also politically, but also I would say internationally. China need to concern about the international image of China. So given that, ultimately Beijing should still respect the one country, two system, in the sense that I think my own personal observation is that some of the people in Hong Kong, they really not necessarily resentment against the Beijing leaders. Some of them really resentment against local officials in Hong Kong. Some of these officials in Hong Kong, bureaucrats, they're really not really listen to the public opinion. So I would say from Beijing's perspective, on the one hand, they highlight the red line, like the national security law. But the next step is that they really need to give Hong Kong people more democracy in the long term. In a sense, allow Hong Kong people to largely elect the local officials, so that the government in Hong Kong will be more accountable for the people in Hong Kong. So I think in the long term, I still see, although many people are so pessimistic these days, they already declared the death sentence of one country, two systems. But I think in the long term, the only way to go is still the one country, two systems. It still depends on how different actors, different groups, how they work with this model. So yeah.
That was a really interesting conversation. Thank you. So we're gonna do one more question, and then I'm going to kind of wrap up because we're getting to the top of the hour. But Dr. Pu has said that he's available to continue asking questions for another half an hour. So if you have to go, stick around for this one question. But if you can stay with us a little bit longer, then please do. So Anna.
Super. Yeah. So we do have one more question. This is from someone in the audience. So their question is there a struggle between different factions in China regarding how to tackle Hong Kong? And is there a risk of the party fracturing because of this?
It's kind of complicated. I would say, I mean, from a scholarly perspective, scholars of Chinese politics, we always like to think about Chinese politics has all kinds of different factions. But in recent years, Chinese leader Xi Jinping has tightened control. So maybe we can now think about there's only one faction, that's Xi Jinping and his followers. So that's the bigger picture. But with that, I would say maybe not like a real factions, but there are different opinions within China. So I would say even people think about China as like a one party authoritarian system. For a lot of important policy issues, there are important policy debates. Scholars, policy advisors, officials, they have different sort of ideas, different emphasis. So one very interesting phenomenon is that after last year's protest, the Chinese government removed a high-level official. So the chief, I think Lian's office chief was removed. He was the sort of top official representing Chinese central government in Hong Kong. He was removed. Maybe we could guess, partially because a lot of people complain, maybe internally, some policy advisors maybe evaluate that guy's job performance. He was too tough. He was ignorant of the public opinion in Hong Kong. Maybe then he was punished, essentially removed from the very important position. So I don't think that there's unlike in early years, there were like clear factions, but at least there are different opinions within the Chinese political system. So some emphasize maybe the Chinese government should be more willing to listen to the opinion of from Hong Kong people. So there are different opinions, let's put that way. So, but not necessarily a clear political factions in nowadays.
Sure.
All right, thank you. So we are at the top of the hour. So if you have to head out, just want to make some final comments. First of all, thank you for joining us. We're very happy that you are here. We'd love to hear what you thought about this event. We have a very quick, less than 1 minute survey. We ask you to fill out civicseries.org/survey. We read every entry, so please fill it out. And then we have a great set of events that are coming up next that we're still confirming the dates for. If you're on our mailing list, then you'll be hearing about them. We're going to be running one on what structural racism looks like in American politics, understanding the healthcare debate, so what the debate is around healthcare in the United States, and also, does my vote matter? If you're able to stick around, we are too, to continuing answering the many questions that we have that have come in. So let me turn it back to Anna.
Great. All right. So another question that we have from a participant, it says, Dr. Pu, if you had a crystal ball, do you see the current Hong Kong-China relationship the same, or will China exert more influence as they seem to desire around the world? So what do you think about, looking into the future, how do you think the relations with Hong Kong and China will continue? Will it remain the same? Will it get better?
So the question is basically Hong Kong's relationship with China. Let's think about the future.
Yeah,
what do you predict?
What would you predict, essentially? Yeah.
Oh, it's difficult to predict. Yeah, I mean, let's put the this way. One way I would say is that the formula of one country, two system may still largely remain, but will gradually, at least in the short term, will move to the emphasis of one country. And I think that the two systems will be shrinking a little bit. I think at least in the short term, that or middle or short term. But the real uncertainty is to what degree the two systems sort of still remain. So in a sense, the shrinking space of two systems. Let me put that way. I think that will be a future trend. But I would also want to emphasize for people in Hong Kong, ultimately they need to think about is that ultimately the long-term sort of destination of Hong Kong and the rest of China, they go together in a sense that if China, Hong Kong want to maintain their liberty, maintain their, maybe become more democratic, that could only happen in the long term when China become more open, even more liberal. I think that's in a longer term, but in the short term, maybe it's not the case. But ultimately, people need to think about Hong Kong's future and China's future. They are tied together. Ultimately, even it's a one country, two system, but ultimately they're tied together.
And just jumping off of that, so if Hong Kong were to be fully absorbed into China, what are geopolitical consequences of that? Or what could be a geopolitical consequence of that?
I think it's kind of difficult in a sense that probably generated more backlashes from many Western countries against China, especially from the United States. I would say at least in the short term that will be the case. But in the long term, I don't know. But again, whether Hong Kong will be like entirely 100% absorbed by China, I doubt it. So I think for a lot of issues like finance, judicial system, to some degree, academic freedom, press freedom, probably still largely remain different from mainland China or the rest of China. I don't think it's highly likely like Hong Kong will like 100% integrated with mainland China. That's less likely, I would say. But again, the two systems, there's a shrinking space for Hong Kong to maintain its distinguished system. That's definitely the short-term trend.
But through this, I'm better understanding why the US has an interest in Hong Kong keeping some of their autonomy, because that trade relationship, it must be a lot easier and to this advantage to maintain a trade relationships with Hong Kong that's very separate and not going through all of the additional complication in their trade relationship with China, having them being separate entities to work with and negotiate with.
Partially related to, because Hong Kong is a very like open, internationalized city in a sense that it's have a very sort of high level of rule of law. So so from American business dealing with Hong Kong sort of business government relationship, very simple, very easy, very compatible with international standard. So and I think from commercial perspective, the United States wants Hong Kong to maintain its high level autonomy. So even from pure economic perspective, that's easier to do business there.
Yeah.
So, but of course, as I said, related to also the democracy, human rights, democracy promotion, that's a long-term American foreign policy goal. That's also another dimension to see this.
Could you talk about a little bit, how does Hong Kong relate to other parts of the world? We've already talked a little bit about the United States and Great Britain, but to other parts of the world, how does Hong Kong relate specifically?
Okay, yeah. I think Hong Kong has a very strong economic relationship with many countries. So as I said, it's one of the top global financial centers. Maybe in terms of status, it's equivalent of New York or London, right? To some degree. Think about that. So a lot of international from Australia, Canada, other countries, European Union, they have business interest in Hong Kong. So, and also Hong Kong maintain sort of a strong social, economic ties with many of these countries. So a lot of like Hong Kong residents, some of them maybe have a different passport. They have Canadian citizenship, British, Australian citizenship, but they live in Hong Kong. And so that's also another dimension. Yeah.
Gotcha. Could you share a little bit about the cultural differences between Hong Kong and China?
Okay.
How do Hong Kongers identify themselves? Is it similar or different from the culture in China?
Okay. So let me give you some examples. In terms of local dialect, the Hong Kong people's, their local dialect is the same as a nearby province called Guangdong. So they both speak Cantonese. So in terms of culture, they're very similar to Guangdong province. But given all these years of like a British colonial rule and all the international interactions with outside world, Hong Kong is also very sort of westernized society. It's the city where East meets the West. So let's put it that way. It's both have traditional, especially southern China, Guangdong sort of culture in terms of language, very similar to Guangdong province, southern province of China. But in terms of culture, society, it's also sort of embrace all the Western, British, American cultures as well. So yeah.
All right, so we have another one here. So just to sum up this question, one participant is asking, do we have a sense of whether people in China want to be independent from China? I think there could be multiple ways to add this, but is there a way for people on the outside to get a sense of what people in Hong Kong truly want with independence and democracy?
Also, so you mean people have a sense of Hong Kong people's aspiration for independence and democracy?
Yes, and to give a little bit of context, this person just has read in a survey only showing that a certain percentage of people supported independence, and they're just wondering is this true? Like, is this a good gauge of the realistic desires of people in Hong Kong?
Yeah, let me put the I think it's difficult to know, in a sense that even in Hong Kong, people there have different political ideas, their relationship with China, their aspiration for either democracy or independence. People have different kinds of ideas. I would say even in Hong Kong, they have polarized the narrative about Hong Kong's past and the future. So there's no consensus. So there's no consensus there. And even the political elites, not just the public, even political elites. Okay. So early in January, I joined a delegation, a National Committee U.S.-China Relations scholar delegation. We visit Hong Kong. We talk with different kinds of politicians, from the chief executive to her political rivals. And we got the idea, they have totally different idea, polarized different ideas. What's the problem of Hong Kong? What's the future? That's political elites. I can imagine the public also have different ideas. But regarding particular questions, I think we need to make a differentiation between average people's aspiration for democracy or their aspiration for independence. I have a sense that most people probably they want to have democracy. They probably know independence is like a complete independence is not a realistic option. So, but some of the protesters, especially younger protesters, maybe they have all these frustrations. They fight for democracy, but they have not seen any progress through this year's struggle. So they use this kind of more radical slogan like independence to really advocate the stronger aspiration is really about democracy. So as I said, independence is not a realistic sort of aspiration for Hong Kong people. So, but some of them have all the frustrations about why they still have not got democracy all these years. So they take a more radical approach or embrace a more radical sort of slogan. But I doubt vast majority of people in Hong Kong really have like the vision that Hong Kong is entirely separated, independent from China. So, because as I said, ultimately in the long term, the future of Hong Kong is tied to the future of China, for better or for worse. So,
could you give an example of maybe what are some other political viewpoints people hold that isn't democracy? Are people in Hong Kong, let's say, agreeing with China, or are there other political ideas? That's not just
there's like on the extreme end, there's complete succession, like complete independence, right? Which you said is not feasible. I guess on the complete other end, it's like it gets completely rolled into China, which is also probably not going to happen. And then there's this like gradient of democracy, somewhere in the middle. So it's like, Anna, like there's a question like, what are the other gradients? There's kind of the democracy that happens right now, which is like the social democracy and freedom of speech, but they don't get to elect their own chief executive. And then there's like, okay, they're still part of China, but they also get to elect their own chief executive. Are there other variations of that?
Yeah. Let me put this way. I think, regarding the sort of like independence activist, small number, or just absorbed Hong Kong as another conventional Chinese city. These two positions extreme. Most people somewhere between, let's put that way, either political leaders, elites, or average people. So they emphasize different. So I think number one, regarding political liberty, freedom of expression, rule of law, I think vast majority of people in Hong Kong, from the chief executive to the average people, they all support this kind of ideas. So Hong Kong should maintain its high level of rule of law. People should have high level of liberty. So this, I think, vast majority of Hong Kong people support that. So I think regarding this probably there's some sort of consensus. Then I think the difference is, how about democracy? Then I think even probably most people still want to have democracy. Then the debate is when and how to get there, right? So for democratic, democratic activists or politicians, we want democracy, universal suffrage right now, as soon as possible. That's one position. Some others say, oh, we can have, but maybe in the short term, in the medium term, we might have some indirect democracy. Let's say Beijing or controlled this elite group to select candidates, then the voters get to vote. So that's the reform package proposed several years earlier, remember I mentioned? So some people may support that. And so others say, oh, no, we either have one direct democracy, one package. We don't want the middle ground sort of. So these issues, they are different positions. Yeah.
All right. All right, so I'm gonna ask just a couple more from those that have been submitted. And so one thing that that came in was someone was asking, what did China and Hong Kong envision would happen after the agreement upon 50 years of Hong Kong being a special administrative region? At the beginning, so how I think I can rephrase it is, at the beginning of the agreement, what was the intention, or what was the, I guess, hope for what would happen at the end of 50 years? Okay,
yeah. Probably I partially addressed these questions earlier. So let me clarify, elaborate a little bit, in a sense that I think that there are different possibilities. One possibility is that after 50 years, maybe the gap between mainland China and Hong Kong will be narrow. In a sense, at that point, economically, mainland China, cities, society would be catch up with Hong Kong. In a sense that, I think that that's already happening to some degree. Like some of the cities near Hong Kong, like Shenzhen, Guangzhou, very prosperous city, very rich city. So in terms of economic, the gap is narrow, definitely narrow. And maybe some Chinese leaders also might imagine even politically or socially, the gap might also narrow, in a sense that maybe China at that point will become more open to the outside world. Maybe China also have a high level of rule of law, high level of liberty, people. So at that point, the meaningful gap between Hong Kong and mainland China will be narrow, in a sense that it does not make much sense or make much difference whether the two systems still maintain. So that's one possibility, in a sense that, in that sense, it's mainland China become more like Hong Kong. It's giant Hong Kong in that sense. It's not a Hong Kong become, so that's the most benign possibility, right? Become more liberal, more open, more prosperous on mainland China, catch up with Hong Kong. So basically, put simply, China will become a giant Hong Kong. Then the one country, two systems, and so what? Not a problem. That's the best case scenario. But the other side is maybe at that point, Hong Kong is totally absorbed by mainland China. So but that will be bad for Hong Kong, maybe also bad for China. I would think there could be a third possibility, in a sense that after 50 years, even the gap is narrow, maybe the two systems might be still maintained, but the two systems, the distinction, the space of two systems is shrinking, in a sense that the system, maybe 20 or 30% of the two systems still remain maintained, but 70% will be the same. I'll give you another very interesting example. Nowadays, the Chinese government has a very ambitious regional development plan called Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area Regional Plan. In the sense that Guangdong is the richest province of China. So it's near Hong Kong and Macau. So this ambitious plan is want to integrate it, Guangdong with Hong Kong and Macau into one sort of economic region, huge economic engine for technology innovation. Think about Bay Area. That we think about San Francisco, San Jose, right? Silicon Valley. So the Chinese government want to integrate Guangdong with Hong Kong and Macau into this giant Silicon Valley, right? So to do that, they must integrate it economically and socially. So in that sense, maybe in the far away future, Hong Kong already economically integrated with mainland China, but still partially their political system, their legal system still maintain distinguished from the rest of China. That's also a possibility.
All right.
So we're getting near the end here, so we're gonna wrap up. I have certainly learned a lot through this session. The thing that's really sticking with me right now is understanding what Hong Kong has its own autonomy and where it doesn't have its own autonomy, like understanding the chief executive's role and how Beijing has a lot of influence on selecting the chief executive. And that's, you know, one of the contentious, you know, places on the spectrum in terms of where Hong Kong could become more of a democracy, yet it still has a lot of these social liberties. So I'm you know, that's what's rattling around in my brain right now. Dr. Pu, is there anything that we didn't cover that you think that we should, anything else you want to share about this topic before we wrap up?
Okay. I think one final point I want to make is that we talk a lot about the U.S. relations with Hong Kong. I want to briefly bring back the British relationship with Hong Kong, in a sense that Hong Kong is what was a colony of Great Britain, of the British Empire. So when negotiated with China, the Great Britain, the British government agree to return the sovereignty to Hong Kong, but with the understanding that Hong Kong could maintain sort of high level autonomy, and people have liberty, and people gradually or eventually will have democracy. So that's the British expectations. But nowadays we get in the point that the issue of Hong Kong is not just a contentious issue between US and China, it's also a contentious issue between UK, the British government, and the Chinese government. So I think moving forward, we might see this will continue to be a sort of challenging issue between China and the British Britain, in a sense that for Great Britain, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, that should be a treaty. That was a treaty, is a treaty that should be valid for a long time. But from the Chinese government, the Sino-British Joint Declaration was a historical document, already served the function to lay the ground for China to establish the one country, two system. So the Chinese government see that as the end of sort of the historical document, the end of China's sort of century of humiliation. But the British government might disagree. So we might see the Hong Kong issue might still be a contentious issue between China and UK in the years to come.
I just want to, we have, so Yang just posted, that's a wonderful and hopeful possibility. China has actually been successful in separating economic development and social development. So there's a chance that this tightrope balance can be pulled off again with Hong Kong. Fingers crossed for Dr. Pu's middle way possibility.
Okay.
Thanks, Yang, for that.
Thank you.
So Dr. Pu, thank you so much for joining us. We've gotten comments from a number of people about how informative this session was for them. So really appreciate your time and being willing to answer all of our questions. Thank you to everybody who joined the Zoom and asked questions, who are joining on YouTube. We really appreciate it. We're going to wrap up. Thank you and good night, everybody.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, great pleasure to talk with all you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for the claps. I see those reactions.